We have Madeleine, did I say it correctly? Bohnett, who is a senior at Shenandoah University. They recently attended a musicology colloquium in Vienna, where they investigated the musicological works on the sounds of EuroPride. Their research interests include the intersection between religion and women, sexuality, and gender studies. Okay, so let's give a round of applause, nice warm welcome for our presenters.
Hello, everyone. So I just want to say thank you for having me here. Yes, the title of my presentation, Exploring the Performance and Expression of Gender in Nina Simone's Mississippi Goddam. So in 1963, two horrific events shaped Nina Simone's composition of Mississippi Goddam. The 16th Street Baptist Church bombing in Birmingham, Alabama, and the assassination of civil rights activist Medgar Evers. Both of these events were acts of white supremacist terrorism, illustrations of the perpetual violence and mistreatment of black bodies in the history of oppression in the United States. Historian Ruth Feldstein notes that after hearing about the bombing, Simone wrote the song in a rush of fury, hatred, and determination, after realizing that she did not know how to build an actual gun, but instead could compose a civil rights song that signified her realization of what it was to be black in America in 1963. Simone's music and politics attracted attention in 1963, coming just 1 month after the March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom and Martin Luther King's notable I Have a Dream speech. Her politics departed from conventional modes of liberal thought in a time oft remembered as the zenith of liberal interracial activism. The song is part of an album released in 1964 entitled In Concert that some scholars, such as Feldstein, have labeled as a shift in Simone's compositional and musical aesthetics choices to a more explicitly political focus. Furthermore, the challenges and critiques of liberalism that Simone poses in her songs within In Concert about race relations led many fans to associate her with black cultural nationalism and black power. The intersectional gendered nature of racism and white supremacy, however, was not to be forgotten. Simone, along with writers such as Alice Childress, Claudia Jones, and Lorraine Hansberry, were black women who, in the late 1950s, already began expanding a model of feminism beyond the domain of cultural production that addressed the intersections of racism and sexism within and outside of the civil rights movement. The composition of Mississippi Goddam, in Simone's own image, is a simulacrum of a weapon of violence, a tool to fight against the demand for purity and order, to fight against racialized, sexualized, and gendered stereotypes that marginalized, silenced, and lynched black bodies through normalized policing. Judith Butler's book, Gender Trouble, speaks to the performance of gender and its reliance on the repetition of a stylized set of acts, such as body gestures, movements, and styles, in order to maintain the impression that gender is a stable identity. Implicit social agreements, constructions of gender norms, and the idea of gender as stable supports the perpetuation of patriarchal binaries that restrict understandings of the diverse nature of expression and subjectivity in musical realms. Putting Butler into conversation with Nina Simone's Mississippi Goddam, this essay asks how gender is reimagined through the ritual performance of the music. How does the performance of the song describe the regulation and empowerment of bodies? Whose bodies are being regulated and empowered, and why? What is the political and social context of this regulation, and why does this regulation of bodies matter? The performative act of Mississippi Goddam is a significant factor in its role as a weapon. In live recordings of Simone performing the track, her hostility toward the audience is portrayed in the way she quickly dismisses the audience after the end of the song. Her hostility is a marker of the performance culture of the time in which many jazz musicians define themselves in opposition to mass culture and to fans. However, rudeness was strongly linked to gendered and racialized expectations, and oftentimes Simone would be essentialized by critics and fans with labels such as mean and angry, while her male counterparts would be referred to as geniuses. Certainly, it is evident that white supremacist patriarchal modes of performing, viewing, and thinking about music have impacted how Simone's audiences would interpret her appearance, her bodily gestures, and her emotions as a black woman. In queer phenomenology, Sarah Ahmed describes how the spaces that bodies inhabit are shaped by the remembrance of the histories of those bodies. Ahmed uses Fanon's analysis on the effects of racism and dehumanization in Black Skin, White Masks, and his argument about how racism interrupts the corporeal schema to explain how bodies are oriented toward one another. If the world, or in this case, the jazz scene in New York, is oriented around whiteness, then the shape of the history of bodies in relation to colonialism only supports certain bodies and their desire and action to extend their reach. In other words, because of how intersectionality is a contributing factor in the performative nature of both race and gender in musical performances, Simone's own bodily orientation in Mississippi Goddam raises questions of how a Black woman can portray herself to the audience. The performance thus becomes a game of power, a violence that provoked anxiety and yet a feeling of security, a claim of disorder and a proposition for order. Besides the transgression of bodied expectations for women musicians, it is noteworthy to highlight the subversive quality of gendered and racialized expectations within the lyrical content. I'm going to pull up some lyrics here, and then get this. Oh, this may not become like too, but let's see.
Yes, you lied to me all these years. You told me to wash and clean my ears and talk real fine just like a lady, and you'd stop calling me Sister Sadie.
Here, Simone addresses the violence enforced by the policing of dirt, pollution, contagion, disorder, of impurity. Being told to wash and clean, to talk like a lady, to essentially eliminate dissonance. She mocks and challenges this, pointing out that doing such acts would not impede discriminatory practices such as calling Black women sister. The term sister specifically carries much significance to Simone, as well as the utopian ideal of sisterhood. Simone positions sisterhood as the pivotal impetus to her politicization around race. As Bell Hooks notes in Feminism is for Everybody, when the feminist movement began, racial integration was still rare, and many Black women who chose to be feminists were hesitant toward expressing their awareness of the complexity of embodying several identities that intersect in a way that creates a hierarchical structure of oppression in which race, class, nationality, gender, capability, and sexuality are all contributing factors in how bodies are marginalized, controlled, and silenced. White women, then, had a tendency to evoke an idealist notion of sisterhood that did not account for the reality of racism and racial difference within liberal circles. It is evident that although Simone critiques this vision of sisterhood, the desire to cultivate a concrete anti-racist structure of sisterhood that acknowledges the discernible traces of white supremacy in liberal politics is apparent in her work both as an activist and a musician. Through these lyrics, Simone also fights against a rape culture that legitimizes the policing of tone, body movements, and hygiene. Her lyrics can function as a reference point to understanding how a drive to legitimate a hegemonic purity culture maintains essentialist stereotypes of Black women, such as that of the strong Black woman. In When Chicken Heads Come to Roost, Joan Morgan describes the strong Black woman myth as a stereotype that, although it has its origins in slavery, continues to be perpetuated partly by contemporary Black women. As Morgan puts it, quote, "As the granddaughters of the civil rights, Black power, and feminist movements, this is a difficult thing to admit. Most of us want to believe that we're finally over some shit, that our egos are finally immune to daily assaults of racism and sexism, but that's far from the case. We've just learned to suffer on the hush-hush." As many of these myths have been perpetuated in order to justify every act, quote, "every act of barbarism it took to keep them, read as Black bodies in line," end quote, the strong Black woman myth dehumanizes Black women by only seeing them as resilient. In scholarly discourse on Nina Simone, authors must take care to not reduce her identity as a Black woman to being unstoppable. Instead of testing the limits to see how far Black female artists, labeled strong Black women, can go in terms of facing the oppressive conditions enabled by a rape culture, music scholars and audiences should question the positions of authority, whether it be white-dominated audiences, the government, or anything else embedded in rape culture, and their dangerous effect on Black women's constructions and performances of identity. Purity and violence animate rape culture. That is to say that rape culture depends both on the demand for purity and the threat of violence that raises the stakes of the demand for purity. This violence may be physical, mental, emotional, or spiritual. It may come in the form of limiting opportunities or conscripting another's time or space. It may be extrajudicial, or it may be sanctioned by the law and even encouraged by lawmakers and the police. In her book, Rape Culture on Campus, Meredith Minister defines rape culture as a socially accepted pattern that legitimates violence in order to police socially non-conforming activities, including expressions of sexuality and gender, masculinity, race, nationality, and capability. The violence enacted in the music and performance of Nina Simone's Mississippi Goddam can be seen as a weapon of subversion of the socially accepted pattern of the violence of the time, which in this context refers to the continuous lynchings of Black bodies in the U.S. The message that Simone conveys demands an understanding that violence enacted against Black bodies, rather than an individual isolated phenomenon, or a set of individual isolated acts such as church bombings and lynchings, is part of a broad cultural phenomenon in which larger economic, social, and political structural systems perpetuate a rape culture that serves to legitimate violence against racial and gendered minorities. Furthermore, to think that the advances between men and women and Black and white Americans in 1964 and even today have been enough to put the history of lynching and the perpetuation of a rape culture that legitimizes violence against women, especially Black women, is behind us is erroneous and dangerous. Toward the end of Mississippi Goddam, Simone challenges the principles associated with liberal civil rights activism in that period.
Oh, this whole country is full of lies. You all gonna die and die like flies. I don't trust you anymore. You keep on saying, go slow. Go slow. What that
In this passage, Simone calls out this whole country as being part of a larger cultural phenomenon and brings into question several apologetic strategies that have been used to fight for equality. Desegregation, mass participation, and reunification are all sung by Simone during a call and response in which "do it slow" is reiterated in between these words. The well-mannered politics of going slow were not sufficient anymore for Black activists in the 1960s. Not only were these strategies not going to be enough to achieve racial equality, they did not acknowledge the gendered nature of racism and colonial patriarchal modes of thinking and being that perpetuate misogyny and rape culture. In Scenes of Subjection, Terror, Slavery, and Self-Making in 19th Century America, Sadia Hartman explains how in 19th century common law, rape was defined as the forcible carnal knowledge of a female against her will and without her consent. However, the actual or attempted rape of an enslaved woman was not recognized as an offense nor punished by law, partially because of Black female stereotypes that hypersexualize the image of the Black woman, but also because white culpability would force colonizers to recognize Black humanity in slave law. By designation of the Black subject as the locality of crime and offense, the state obscured its contribution in a rape culture by placing all fault onto the enslaved. The Black body thus became the site on which the corruption and violence of the hegemonic white supremacist class and of the state were materialized into the form of threat and the demand for purity. As I stated previously regarding the history of bodies and the consideration of a queer phenomenology, the history of a gendered and racialized body must be recognized when considering the performance of a musical work like Mississippi Goddam. It is apparent that the scenes of subjection that Hartman describes in her book still impact how bodies are oriented in space in 1964 and still today. To return to the point on the hypersexualized image of the Black woman, it is important to note how the concept of seduction has been used against enslaved Black women and thereafter to engender a construction of female sexuality in which rape is inconceivable. In this sense, one can understand why Nina Simone would not, quote, trust you anymore. How can Simone feel comfortable with a liberal political environment that does not acknowledge the history of the Black female body in regards to a rape culture that continues to condone violence against her body? With the influence of events and issues such as the assassination of Martin Luther King Jr., gender discrimination, and color consciousness among Black Americans, Simone articulates the growing restlessness for positive change in civil rights issues regarding Black freedom and women and gender equality. Moreover, as Audre Lorde has said, the master's tools would never dismantle the master's house. How can equality be achieved if the structures that are meant to produce change are racist, classist, and patriarchal? Putting the performance of Mississippi Goddam in the framework of Minister's concept of rape culture shifts the focus away from thinking about the individual acts of violence that inspired the song into considering the larger implications of the song's message and its impact as a sound of protest that challenges the normativity of sexual violence and the implicit lack of a concrete deconstruction of the socially tolerable violence that allows Black female bodies to be exploited for, as Hartman describes, pleasure, profit, and punishment. Jacques Attali's notion of noise as violence is inherently linked to what Meredith Minister describes as rape culture. In Noise, the Political Economy of Music, Jacques Attali theorizes that, quote, the fundamental status of music must be deciphered through that of noise. Noise is a weapon, and music, primordially, is the formation, domestication, and ritualization of that weapon as a simulacrum of ritual murder, end quote. Similar to how Minister describes policing acts that legitimize rape culture, Attali describes how noise, therefore music itself, is a weapon that performs murder. As it exists, noise is violent. It disturbs, interrupts, disconnects. To be such means that it can act as a violation of one's sonic environment, and similar to Billie Holiday's Strange Fruit, Simone's Mississippi Goddam invokes a sacrifice of time and space. To assume that there was noisy violence at the birth of civilization can allow us to consider how violence can be echoed in the forms of institutional and microaggressive practices that condone sexual, gendered, and racialized violence against bodies. In a way, the violence that Simone describes and enacts in the performance of Mississippi Goddam can be thought of as a simulacrum of the emerging organization of human interaction at the origin of civilization. By invoking a presence of the bodies of the girls who were killed in the church bombing and Medgar Evers, Simone creates a setting in which audiences are forced to face the ritual murders of Black bodies in the context of a musical experience. The performance and enactment of this violence gives audiences a channel through which to re-experience the murderous and harrowing basis of humanity without reenacting the actual crime itself. As a ritual, the value of the performance of Mississippi Goddam must be questioned. Who profited off this performance? As Carvalho asks of the value of the performance of Strange Fruit, quote, whose interests were served by it? Did it raise public awareness of the violence of whites against Blacks? Or did it placate white guilt by simulating that violence, effectively repeating in the socially acceptable form of music what the lyrics made out to be socially unacceptable behavior? End quote. In other words, has the potential value of Simone's composition, performance, and labor been exploited to reify the economic, social, and political exploitation and marginalization of Black women's bodies? Simone's own body, associated with a history of racism, sexism, mental health issues, and white supremacist violence, has not only been appropriated to fit an essentialized narrative, thinking back to the strong Black woman myth, it has also been distorted, made into an object for which white audiences can place limitations on where and when Simone's body can reach other bodies and objects. Whiteness, then, serves as a catalyst for audiences to relieve their guilt of the civilizing and purifying crimes of racism and sexism by inviting participation in the simulacrum of a violent ritual and performance of Mississippi Goddam as an outsider who cannot reach Simone's body. Understood not only as an act of resistance against patriarchal assumptions about female jazz musicians, Nina Simone's composition and performance of Mississippi Goddam illustrates the complexity of agency and subjectivity in gender performativity in the lens of the strong Black woman myth, the political economy of music, and experiences cultivated in living in a society that enforces a culture of sexual and racial purity. Through sacrificial channelizations of violence, perspectives on Black freedom and gender circulated widely in the early 1960s. Therein lies an important value of Mississippi Goddam. As a mobilizing weapon of noise, the performance and expression of this protest song fights back against a culture of rape and murder. Thank you.
All right, so we'll open the floor for discussion. Are there any questions for either of our presenters on their work?
I have a question. So, going back to the first set of lyrics that you used, and why did you interpret that phraseology the way you did?
Sure. Is there like a specific line that stood out to you? Or
Well, just when you look at it, it says you lied to me all these years. You told me to wash and clean my ears and talk like a fine lady, talk fine just like a lady. Well, that goes to her upbringing because she was raised in the South, and because she was a prodigy, they tried to, make her presentable for when she entered Juliet. And then where it says, and you stop calling me Sister Sadie. Well, that's a Southern thing, whereby rather than giving you respect for calling you Mrs. or Ms., they called you Auntie or Sister. So that's why I was trying to understand your interpretation of.
Oh yeah, I really appreciate that comment. I could definitely look more into the actual political or the historical context with her upbringing and everything. What really intrigued me about this line and the way that I started to think about it in terms of purity culture was because of a reading that I actually had been doing for another class called Sex and Gender and Religion, and the idea of specifically about dirt in terms of social order and pollution in those lenses, which is kind of how I ended up pursuing it this way. But yeah, thank you for that.
Time for another question.
Okay, so going back to what you were saying about the concert album and about how she inhabited the space. Okay, can you go back and kind of clarify that for me? Because
was there like a specific idea that the entire, what do you mean about the album or?
Okay, so you said, I got what you were saying about it being a political shift based on what went on, what was going on in the times. But more specifically, you said you were talking about how history inhabits the space, and you were equating that to her personification of when she first performed, the very first time she performed Mississippi Goddam was amazing to me because she was the only Black in the entire building. And it was in New York, and it was at Carnegie Hall. So to me, and when you see interviews with her, she was so bodacious anyway. I think it was kind of a FU attitude more than it was.
Yeah, I would agree with that for sure.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, and part of the reason why I use the words that I do, like with space and orientation and history of bodies, that really comes from, as I mentioned, Sarah Ahmed's book, Queer Phenomenology. She discusses a lot about the orientation of people around certain objects or things. She uses the idea of a table to describe how certain bodies are, like the philosopher's table, and how that can be considered gendered and racialized as well. But yeah, I definitely can agree. There were from what I've researched, the reception of her performing Mississippi Goddam in the majority of cases was overall positive, even though she did bring this kind of attitude of "fu" or whatever that you would see sometimes. But yeah, thanks.
Thank you all very much. Let's give our presenters another. And have a great afternoon, everybody.